Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marc Meyer. I'm the Southern Sierra Province ecologist with the Region 5 Ecology Program of the Forest Service, working in the Southern Sierra, California. And today I'm going to talk to you about a framework for post-fire restoration in California's national forests. This is shifting gears a little bit from Joe and John's presentation earlier. We're talking about management post-fire, particularly after wildfires. This is a collaborative project that many of us have been working on, as you can see the long list of authors here, with the Region 5 Ecology Program, the Pacific Southwest Research Station of the Forest Service, and other collaborators in Region 5. So a brief outline of what I'm going to discuss. First, go over the overall purpose and need of this project, describe the main elements, including guiding principles in the restoration framework, and then lastly, illustrate the restoration framework using a case study from mixed conifer forest ecosystems. But keep in mind, this project is soon to come out as a general technical report, and in that report, we also illustrate this restoration framework using chaparral ecosystems and sagebrush steppe in parts of various parts of California. The purpose of this project is to develop a science-based framework for the development of post-fire restoration strategies on the national forests in California. And for those who aren't familiar, after large stand-replacing wildfires and other disturbance events, a restoration strategy might be developed to describe the broad ecological restoration approaches that support ecosystem management goals and objectives in a particular landscape of interest, that is a large burned landscape. Many of us that worked on this development of this post-fire restoration framework over the last several years immediately identified that our current approach on national forests in California and many places elsewhere in the country seem to be largely tactical and conventional. That is, they seem to be more reactionary than proactive in nature, based on a narrow range of restoration objectives. Often, these approaches do not address our larger, more severe wildfires, particularly when we're thinking about interacting stressors such as the effects of wildfires, invasive species, and climate change. And many of these actions may lack context, landscape context for restoration actions such as reforestation. There's a number of advantages to the framework that we've developed. One is it uses a landscape scale strategic approach rather than that more reactionary approach. It focuses on long-term recovery rather than looking at the short-term gains or short-term changes. It recognizes both positive and negative effects of fire. And I think this is an important point because oftentimes the current approach focuses immediately on the negative effects of the fire and doesn't look at those other positive effects or neutral effects. It promotes integrative and creative approaches. And lastly, it explicitly evaluates climate change effects. This is a diagram or figure that illustrates the basic guiding principles that underlie this framework. And they include restoring key ecological processes, such as restoring natural fire regimes, considering the landscape context beyond just the fire perimeter. It also includes promoting regional native biodiversity, sustaining diverse ecosystem services, establishing a prioritization approach for management interventions, and incorporating adaptation to agents of change, such as climate change. These guiding principles serve as the foundation for what we're calling the restoration framework, which is a 5-step process I'll go over in more detail in a minute. And it's this restoration framework that then informs the planning and implementation of restoration projects in a burned landscape. And of course, monitoring could be used besides from an adaptive management standpoint to change implementation of the project. And it could also be used to feed back to the restoration framework to reevaluate conditions if they change significantly on that landscape. So these are the 5 steps in our restoration framework, and I'm going to go over these in a little bit of detail step by step. The first is fairly simple. You assemble an interdisciplinary team, identify priority resources, desired conditions, and restoration goals. Many of these goals and desired conditions can come from our forest plans and other resource documents. Secondly, you'd gather and analyze relevant spatial data. And I'm going to go over this in a little bit more detail, the second step. So in this data gathering analysis phase, you'd assess post-fire ecological condition by taking such spatial data layers as pre-fire vegetation, fire effects data, such as the vegetation burn severity data is one example. And then you'd also want to spatially depict your priority resources. This could be sensitive or key wildlife habitat within your landscape or vegetation types, for example. Then in the second step, you'd want to consider other factors that may influence post-fire recovery. This could include the effects of climate change, invasive species, or so on. And thirdly, you could incorporate additional analysis tools. And there's a variety of these tools that are available, but just one as an example is a predictive post-fire conifer regeneration tool, which gives predictive outputs of the probability of natural conifer regeneration in a bird landscape. This is an illustration of a map showing the 2015 rough fire, which burned on the Sequoia National Forest, as well the Sierra National Forest and some other public lands, and illustrates our mixed conifer forest case study. And what you can see is the areas in color indicate vegetation burn severity. Areas in red are stand replacing, high severity burned areas. Areas in green are low severity burned areas. The areas in the cross hatching indicate fisher habitat. This is a species of conservation concern within this landscape in the southern Sierra Nevada. So this is shown as one of our focal resources, as well as areas outlined in blue, which are giant sequoia groves, another focal resource of interest. So we can begin to start to depict some of these focal resources, the vegetation burn severity, and in the upper right corner, that inset map illustrates areas of mixed conifer forest in particular, showing that conifer, post-fire conifer prediction tool, which shows the probability of natural regeneration within that landscape. So we can begin to pull some of these data layers together to better understand what those fire effects are in the landscape. Once we have those data layers compiled, then we can go to our next step, number 3, and use our post-fire flow chart to identify restoration opportunities. So let's go over this step in a little bit more detail. This post-fire flow chart is really think of it as a decision tree. It helps us identify different restoration opportunities in the landscape with a series of simple questions. The first question at the top box asks, where did fire improve or maintain ecological conditions, and where are fire effects within the natural range of variability, or NRV? If we find conditions are improved or maintained, that is, fire effects are largely beneficial, then we'd end up on the left side of the chart. If fire effects are negative, where conditions are graded, we're on the right side of the chart. And we can begin to evaluate some of those spatial data sets I mentioned earlier, departure from the natural range of variability by some of those spatial data layers, vegetation, burn severity, and so on. In this case, we're looking largely at areas where you have large patches of high severity fire, which may be departed from the natural range of variability. So areas that fall within NRV are depicted in green. These tend to be low to moderate severity burned areas or smaller patches of high severity fire. Areas in yellow are moderately departed, and areas in red are extremely departed. These, as I said, just tend to be the larger high severity patches which depart from desired conditions in NRV. So we can identify those parts in the landscape and actually depict those areas here on our flow chart where we want to ask those particular questions. So box A, if we end up on the left side, if you remember, those are areas where fire was largely beneficial. We then ask the question, where do other factors threaten ecological resilience and sustainability? If there are other factors present, such as, say, invasive species, we end up on the right side of the chart where we're at higher risk. But if those factors are absent, we'd end up in areas where we're at low risk. And these are areas where we call our first restoration opportunities to maintain or promote desired conditions. So those are those green areas in particular on that last figure that I showed. In contrast, if areas are degraded by fire, that is, we find negative fire effects, think about our particularly larger high severity patches, we'd ask the question in box B, where are management approaches feasible for the restoration of desired conditions given current and anticipated future conditions? If we find these areas where restoration is feasible, considering a variety of factors such as accessibility, then we'd end up at restoration opportunity 2 in that second box. We could take management actions to restore those desired conditions, or if we identify areas in the landscape where restoration is not feasible, we'd end up at the third box to reevaluate our desired conditions considering climate change and other stressors. And I think this is an important point because, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we often, the more conventional approach is to really jump to box 2, that second, without thinking about the positive or neutral effects of fire, or areas where we want to completely reevaluate our desired conditions simply because of feasibility constraints, maybe they're not accessible, or for other reasons such as converting to other vegetation types. So then we get to our last 2 steps on our restoration framework, steps 4 and 5. 4 says, develop and integrate restoration opportunities into potential restoration actions. And then lastly, step 5 is to build a restoration portfolio by prioritizing these actions. So let's go over this last couple steps in more detail. The restoration portfolio is a suite of potential restoration actions. Think of it as that menu of actions that fall in one of those 3 categories I mentioned earlier. And you'd be, in this case, the restoration portfolio, you would consider feasibility of each of those actions, the timing, whether the short, long-term, mid-term actions, and the integration of those actions, whether individual actions can be grouped together for greater efficiency and effectiveness. Then you would group those actions under those 3 categories, those restoration opportunities I mentioned earlier, whether they fall under maintaining or promoting desired conditions, taking management actions, or reevaluating their desired conditions. And then lastly, you would spatially define and ideally field refine each of these actions under the 3 restoration opportunities. And just really briefly, this is an example how you can present it, a very short version of it in a tabular format, where you have your 3 restoration opportunities that include specific target areas within our landscape, usually areas of our focal resources, management actions associated with each of those, as well as the timing and feasibility of each of those actions. And then beyond just showing this in a table, we can also spatially depict this or map this restoration portfolio by showing each of those restoration opportunities, such as the maintain or promote desired conditions, are the areas in orange. These might be areas that are simply prioritized for monitoring. Areas that are in that tannish color, that those are areas where you might run a reevaluator of desired conditions. These say are areas that are mixed conifer forest that might be converting to hardwood forest with the interacting effects of climate change, fire, and other stressors. Areas in aqua are areas where we might want to take management actions, such as reintroducing fire again in this burn landscape using prescribed fire at some future point down the line. So maybe another 5 to 10 years, those areas might still have elevated fuels. So reintroducing fire again might be beneficial. And lastly, the areas in blue might be areas you'd want to take reforestation actions where you see potential conifer regeneration failure. Think about those larger high severity patch sizes where conifer seeds cannot disperse into effectively. So with that, I know there'll be a presentation by Gabrielle later. We'll go into a little more detail about this post-fire restoration framework, but I just want to acknowledge our funding and other sources that supported this project, including the Natural Areas Association Conference, where we had a workshop back about 4 years ago. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully it was an interesting presentation.